pile of corpses. Repulsive. A disgrace to our nation. In 1819, the Paris Salon was the most prestigious art event in the world. People went there to see heroes, royalty, and beauty. Instead, they walked into a room and came face to face with this. Look closely at the skin on this arm. This isn't the warm, healthy, golden glow of a Renaissance painting. It's green, it's grey. It has that unmistakable, waxy texture of flesh that has already started to rot. The critics didn't just hate it, they were physically disgusted. They asked, how could a painter capture the texture of death with such horrifying precision? The answer is simple, and it's disturbing. Theodore Géricault didn't use wooden mannequins. He didn't rely on paid models alone. To get that exact shade of green, he needed references you can't buy in any art supply store. He needed the real thing, and to get it, he crossed a line that turned his private studio into a morgue. To understand why this painting was seen as a crime against the taste of its time, we need to go back to 1816. France was desperately trying to forget the Napoleonic Wars. The restored monarchy had one clear rule for art: paint heroes, paint victories, paint nobility. The last thing they wanted to see was the failure of the state, stretched across a canvas 7 meters wide. But Theodore Géricault wasn't an ordinary painter looking for approval. At 27, he was the definition of a tortured genius. Wealthy, emotionally unstable, and tangled in a sexual scandal involving his own aunt, he made a radical decision. He shaved his head, cut ties with high society, and locked himself away to create something that would define his career. He chose the shipwreck of the frigate Medusa, not just because it was tragic, but because it was a political cover-up. The government wanted that story to disappear. Géricault decided he would immortalize it. But there was a problem. He didn't just want to imagine the suffering of those men. He wanted to document it scientifically. Reading newspaper reports about the disaster wasn't enough to feed his obsession. He needed to smell the tragedy, and to turn his studio into a stage for real, unbearable horror. He was about to commit an act that, today, would land him in prison immediately. Géricault began visiting morgues and the Beaujon Hospital in Paris, but he didn't go there just to observe. Historical accounts and biographers confirm it. He secretly negotiated to remove study materials and bring them home. We're talking amputated arms, feet, and most disturbingly of all, a severed human head obtained through contacts inside an asylum. His studio on Faubourg de Roule stopped being a place of art and became a morgue. Witnesses said the stench of decay was so unbearable that neighbors constantly complained. But Géricault worked in absolute silence, surrounded by human remains hidden under his bed and laid out on his tables. He even went so far as to keep the asylum head on the roof of his studio for 2 weeks, just so he could draw, day after day, the exact stages of decomposition out in the open air. When you look at the painting today, you're not seeing creative freedom. That outstretched arm in the lower left corner, it wasn't invented. It was painted while he studied a real limb rotting right in front of him. He turned anatomy into art, but he had a problem. He had the perfect bodies and the exact texture of death. But he was missing something corpses couldn't tell him. The truth about what really happened during those 13 days at sea. And what he discovered when he tracked down the survivors was even more disturbing than the bodies in his studio. If you value stories museums would rather keep hidden, leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It's the only way to make sure you don't miss the next investigations. Now brace yourself, because what the survivors revealed would change everything. He interviewed the doctor Henri Savigny and the engineer Alexandre Correa, listening to testimonies that sounded like they belonged to a private hell. The story was shameful. When the frigate Medusa ran aground, the captain, a man appointed through political favors and with no real experience, abandoned 147 people on an improvised raft, while the elite escaped in lifeboats. What followed were 13 days of madness. On the first night, 20 men were murdered. By the fourth day, desperation reached its peak, and the survivors crossed the final boundary of humanity: cannibalism. But Géricault made an intriguing artistic decision. He chose not to paint the cannibalism explicitly. Instead, he hid it in plain sight. If you look closely at the raft, you'll notice a blood-stained axe lying on the floor. It's there to recall the moment they decided who would live and who would die. Look at the torso of one of the men in the left corner. His lower half is missing, a subtle reference to the pieces of human flesh that were consumed to avoid dying of hunger. But the greatest scandal in the painting wasn't the blood or the flesh. It was an act of political rebellion. At the top of the pyramid of bodies, the man waving a cloth for help is Jean-Charles, a black man. In a time when slavery was still fueling the French economy, Géricault placed a black man as the symbol of hope and of humanity's survival itself. He had the macabre technique. He had the explosive story. He had the political provocation. Géricault believed that when he unveiled this work, he would change the world. But what he received in return was something his already fragile mind could never have imagined surviving. When the Paris Salon opened its doors in 1819, Géricault was exhausted. He had spent 8 months locked away with corpses, living in absolute silence, broken only by the sound of his brushes. He was expecting monumental acclaim. But reality hit him like a punch to the stomach. The French elite didn't see a masterpiece. They saw an insult. The monarchists were furious at the open political criticism and called the painting a disgusting pile of corpses. The government he had been so determined to confront simply refused to buy the work. Géricault, already struggling with depression, collapsed. The public humiliation and financial failure pushed him into a mental breakdown. He felt like he had sacrificed his sanity and lived among the dead for nothing. But as he withered away, the painting itself began to undergo a bizarre transformation. In his obsession with achieving deep, dark tones, Géricault made a serious technical mistake. He used an excessive amount of bitumen. Substance gives an immediate, magnificent sheen, but it never truly dries. Over the years, the bitumen began to run and darken the canvas, creating a wrinkled surface. Géricault's raft was committing a slow suicide, just like its creator. In 1824, at just 32 years old, the man who stole ahead in pursuit of immortality died poor, convinced his masterpiece had been a mistake. It seemed like the tragic end of a madman who lost everything to his own obsession. But history has a cruel way of turning failure into legend. And what happened after Géricault's death would transform that doomed raft into the most powerful symbol France would ever claim. After Géricault's death, the Louvre Museum finally acquired the work. Ironically, the painting the government tried to censor and the critics tried to bury became one of the crown jewels of France. Today, it's considered the museum's second most popular painting, surpassed only by the Mona Lisa. Géricault's sacrifice wasn't in vain. He destroyed his health and his reputation to create a new kind of art, one that wasn't afraid to stare into the abyss. He proved that beauty could be found in the rawest, most brutal truth, even if that truth smelled like a morgue. The raft of the Medusa stopped being just the story of a shipwreck in 1816. It became an eternal symbol of the common man fighting against the negligence of the powerful. Every time you look at those greenish bodies, at the desperation in the survivors' eyes, you're seeing the result of a man who tore through society's rules to show us what we really are when everything is taken away. But there's still one question historians continue to debate. Now that you know this masterpiece was built on real human remains and on an obsession that bordered on insanity, can you still look at it and see only art? Or every time you look into the faces of those men, will you remember the head stolen from an asylum that served as their model? Tell me what you think in the comments. Does the end justify the means in art? Or did Géricault go too far? If this investigation was worth your time, leave a like. And if you want to keep uncovering the forbidden stories museums try to hide, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. I'll be reading your replies in the comments. Welcome to Behind the Frame.